Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney Brahm, the Engage Program Manager here at Sentinel Blue, and I'm here today with the lovely Stacy Bostjanick, and we're here to talk about why assessment is not the end of the story. Before we jump straight into that, Stacy's here because she's done many amazing things. So, do you just want to give us a little recap of where you're at now and your path to getting to that seat?
Sure. So I currently am the Vice President of Government Strategy for CyberStec Investments, which is a C3 PAO for the CMMC program. They also have some other areas that they can consult and do assessments in. To get here, I spent 37 years in the federal government, right? And we laugh because I began my 37 years as the secretary for the applied math branch at NSWC White Oak before they blew themselves up. When they blew themselves up, we got base realignment and closed, and I spent a year and a half at the National Institute of Standards and Technology doing contracting and acquisition for them. They were definitely a different perspective than being with the Department of Defense. So I stayed there about a year and a half and then got back to NavAir. From NavAir, I took a role with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and was in their procurement shop there. And then I worked there for 3 or 4 years, and then I went to the Missile Defense Agency and was a senior contracting officer for them. Then I took a job at the Defense Intelligence Agency and was their head of contracting. And when I was at DIA, they adopted the perspective that every senior executive needs to rotate every 3 years. I remained in my spot for 4.5 years, and then they asked me to go on a rotation. And I ended up at the Pentagon working for the Defense Pricing and Contracting Group. And then I ended up from there moving into the Protecting Critical Technologies Task Force, and that introduced me to Katie Arrington in the CMMC program. And so from there, I ended up leaving the Defense Intelligence Agency and going into the Pentagon, working for OUSD ANS, originally as the Director of Supply Chain Risk Management. When the Biden administration came in, they wanted to relook the CMMC program. And so at that point in time, that program was moved to the CIO's office. So I ended my 37 years at in the CIO's office as the director of Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity, right? So my role was to be the liaison with the DIB to help them and to ensure that they were meeting the standards and requirements that we had asked them to do since 2017, right? So one of the reasons CMMC even exists is when we began this whole journey. I think the rulemaking for the 7012 clause started in 2013, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so originally, they came out and they asked the Defense Industrial Base to comply with the NIST 853, which is a lot larger. And the industry said, whoa, that's too much. We can't do that. So they developed a bespoke requirement, the NIST 800-171, for the Defense Industrial Base. And they agreed, okay, we'll do this. This is we can handle this. And so the 7012 clause went into effect, and as of December 31st of 2017, if a company was handling controlled unclassified information, they were to comply with the 7012 clause and meeting the requirements of the NIST 800-171. Right? And now that clause made you have a system security plan and a plan of action and milestone to get there. And they left it on the companies to self-attest and report on themselves. And what we found was the DoD and the Navy Cyber Readiness Review in 2018 went out and took a look. Nobody was doing it, right? We found companies that had downloaded a system security plan from the internet that had insert company name here, and it didn't apply to anything they had in their network. They had plans of actions and milestones that weren't going to be begun to be closed till 2099. I'll be dead by then, right? So it's not particularly helpful at protecting our data and information. So when I was on the Protecting Critical Technologies Task Force, that's where, the recognition that our adversaries had been taking all our data and information, right? That's
Yeah.
when the Chinese F-35 came up. There's some military vehicles that have been exactly replicated based on the fact that they've been able to exfil data from our supply lines. And, the difficulty is, and as a taxpayer, right, I'm sure anybody who's heard me speak before has heard me say this, right? It really upsets me as a taxpayer that we spend millions and billions of dollars to develop and engineer these exquisite weapon systems to only allow them to get stolen in a 15-minute download.
Yeah.
Right now, they're not getting all of the classified stuff that might be on that aircraft, but they sure as heck have got the design down to the cockpit flaw, right? They didn't even fix anything. They didn't even bother to do any of their own research and development. They just downloaded it and manufactured the same thing. And I recognize that the department now is very interested in what they presented in the Arsenal of Freedom, right? Let's reduce requirements and go faster.
Yeah.
But the thing that you have to understand is they didn't have to spend millions and billions of dollars to develop it. So the money we spent to develop it, they can now use to expedite their manufacturing. I got to go back out to Congress and to the public and say, hey, can you give me some more money so I can manufacture faster and get things to production? So we're in an armed conflict. And I'm sorry, but if I'm in an armed conflict, I don't want to just say, oh, I'm going to win because I got five more than they do. I want the superior weapon system, right? So, one of the reasons why this whole thing began is because we are in an adversarial situation with most of our near peer countries that have utilized cybersecurity to get ahead, right? And the problem that we have is companies and U.S. citizens don't recognize the threat because there aren't burned out buildings and bombed out, bombings or dead bodies laying around.
Yeah.
So it's kind of invisible to them the damage that's been done based on these cyber attacks. And unfortunately, I laugh. Well, I don't laugh, but I wonder what is it going to take, right? We had the Columbia pipeline where we on the East Coast couldn't get gas for a week, and everybody's like, oh yeah, that was just so it wasn't that big of a deal. We don't need to do that much. Nobody cares about me. Nobody's coming after me. We've had our electrical grid hit. We heard with this latest interaction that we've had with Iran that they're in our infrastructure, they're in our water, they're in our electric grid. They've got ability, right? They haven't pulled the trigger on that. And, I have to ask the question, what's it going to take? Is it going to take them disabling our economy for a month and people actually dying to have people wake up? So, the thing with the CMMC, right? So, why are we where we are? One, because the people that were handling our data kind of blew us off and didn't meet the standards that we asked them. So, we need to validate it. But we also need to bring the understanding and recognition and awareness to the nation that we need to be on top of our cybersecurity, right? I mean, we had hoped when we started this, and the cyber AB doesn't like it when I say this, but at some point I would love to get to the point where we don't need to have the certification and verification, that people recognize the importance of this. And the other thought that we had when we started this was people would start to learn how to anticipate, right? How to think through, these are the vectors that I'm getting hit with. I can see that because I'm doing the 800-171. And we all know that 800-171 isn't the end all be all. It's not it's not that much, right? When you talk to the uber cyber geeks, right, the kids that can come in that are 11 years old and get into your banking account in 2.3 seconds, this
Yeah.
is just the 800-171 won't stop a nation state actor. It may give you awareness where you can go, there's a blip that, I'm getting
Yeah.
hit, right? And so, the hope is to bring that cyber awareness to continue to move the ball. As we've already seen, right? We started out with 800-171 Rev 2. They've already come out with Rev 3, right? So
Yeah.
it's going to continue to build
Yeah.
because Rev 2 may have stopped a bunch of 11-year-olds that were from the 2000s, right?
Yeah.
Now we got to stop the 11 years from the 2020s.
Yeah.
And so, we have to continuously evolve these requirements to stay ahead of the threat. And sadly, our current regulatory process actually puts us in a tough spot because we can't stay ahead of the threat, right?
Yeah.
Because OMB-OIRA forced the Department of War to tie the CMMC rule and program to a certain revision.
Yeah.
So now Department of War can't require Rev 3 until I do a rulemaking activity,
Yeah.
until they do a rule. I'm not there anymore. I got to remind myself, right? Till those nasty government people do a rulemaking activity to implement that Rev 3. Now, some of the other agencies are coming out saying they're going straight to Rev 3, right? Like GSA is
Yeah.
requiring that. Now, when I spoke with the individuals at GSA, those requirements are going to be for their internal IT program. So it's not going to tip the scale to over 10 contractors so they can get away without having to do it through rulemaking. But others are going to have to, and they're
Yeah.
going to adopt a requirement, but
So let's unpack that a little bit. That covered like a broad range of how you got this, and you certainly have been around the block with how we got to where we are. So talking about revision 2, we, are talking to lots of potential clients, and the thing we frequently hear is like, well, is this compliant? Like they're trying to do something and they just want to know if it's compliant and not the most secure. But what, in your opinion, is the biggest risk to those specific things, especially as we look towards Rev 3? We know that there are these increased requirements. So when companies aren't focused on the security mindset of their company and they're focused on, I need to just hit this check box so that I can keep my contracting going. What do you see organizational's biggest risk there that is getting overlooked, and why we are not getting out of this mindset of it's just a compliance checkbox?
right. Well, and it is the biggest risk is you're not ever vigilant, right? And
Yeah.
so as threats evolve, you're not paying attention, right? I got my checkbox 3 years ago. I gotta check in on it, and you get lackadaisical about it, right? And sadly, what we've seen is nobody gets religion about cybersecurity until they're sitting with a ransomware attack and somebody wants them to pay them $2 million, right? That's when all of a sudden, I need to get off the dime and do something. And I would say, don't wait. Don't let it go until the point at which you are sitting with a $2 million bill to get your data back,
Yeah.
right? And, the one thing that the department hasn't done to date that I could see coming in the future with the advent of AI, right? So,
Yeah.
used to be we can't, or data's different, and it's at different levels. So it's hard to say, hey, if you lose a gigabyte of data, I'm going to charge you, or gigabyte of my data, I'm going to charge you $500,000 for that, right?
Yeah.
But and so the damage assessment and the damage to the programs, because you have to go through and look at everything that was taken and understand the impact, oftentimes it has taken too long and the contract's over before they ever realize what the damage to the program is. With the entrance of AI and that capability to help move that along faster, what you could see is options not being exercised and contracts being canceled, right? Because from one perspective, does it make sense to continue the innovative and development of that program when we know our adversaries have already gotten it,
Yeah.
right? And can you come back from it? Can you change it enough to make it so where we can still stand up and have the superior system to our adversaries, because they've already got the technology, they've already stolen all that innovation. Is it worth our dollar to be bothered?
Yeah. So thinking about that, and especially thinking about trying to get people to invest in the mindset that this is security, there's the one person at the company who usually gets it. That's your IT person who's driving something. But then you have your executives, but then you also have your everyday users. From your background, how do you like to approach getting them invested? Because again, the person who knows. Like we know when CrowdStrike was down and we had a week of flight delays, that was just a wake up call. That was not the real show. But
I was trying to get to the Bahamas, so it was a real pain.
how do we get the people who are making the decisions or doing the work every day to understand you need to
Right.
not just think I'm checking a compliance box, I'm running a security program.
So when we went through building the program for the CMMC, one of the discussion topics was that oftentimes the poor guy in the trenches, the IT dude, is like, no, this is important. You need to put funds here. We need to build this, and the C-suite was kind of like, nobody cares about us. I'm not going to do that. I need to put money in other places first, right?
Yeah.
Or I need the profits for myself first. I don't want to divert those funds. So that's one of the reasons why we have asked for someone in the government asked for somebody in the C-suite or somebody in a responsible position to make an annual affirmation that they are still compliant and they're still tracking their system right now. If they blow it off and they don't pay attention to it, then the government can hold them accountable under the False Claims Act. Now, that is not where we want to be, right? We really don't want to have to go after people and go through litigation, and that's not what the federal government writ large is looking to do, right? And it's funny, you talk about, what do you tell your friend, the workers? And I have to laugh because I have a very good friend, and she's like, "Oh my God, I just want to do my work, and now I got to do all this stuff to get to the CUI part, and I just want to do my work." And I'm sure that the manufacturers, when we first started enforcing OSHA requirements, probably said the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Now, the differential is when we started putting OSHA requirements, we definitely saw kids getting hurt and adults getting hurt and people having real impact to their lives directly because they've lost an arm because we weren't
Yeah.
doing what we were supposed to with the machinery, or we weren't wearing the proper clothing, all that kind of stuff. We've got to get to the point where people recognize that cyber is the new OSHA,
Yeah.
right? It's the new ISO kind of standard that you've got to meet for doing what you do to secure yourself, right?
Yeah.
And I think, sadly, if everybody took a step back, right, and said, let's look at the state of where we are today, right? We've got adversarial nations buying land right next to our bases,
Yeah.
right? We've got them putting back doors in drones, that if somebody flies a drone, all that data and information goes back to their homeland, right? It phones home.
Yeah.
And it's funny because we as Americans are very uptight and don't want the government to be in our business and have their fingers in my pie, because they'll figure out, they're going to spy on me and they're going to figure out if I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah.
But we don't care that the Chinese are doing it. And I have to tell you, they got way more people to go through all that data and find out when you're cheating on your wife than anybody in the U.S. government does, right?
Yeah.
And so I think I don't know if I should say it amuses me, but it does make me kind of do that Rottweiler thing where you crack your head and go, what? Why are you, more concerned about the U.S. government having information than you are about an adversarial nation?
Yeah, very true. I think I'd say that all the time. I know you mentioned it earlier, but I talk about when are people going to realize cyber is the 9/11 that occurs every day, and that we are seeing these increased threats that are occurring all the time. That back in 2001 was a physical response, like people physically saw it. But like, do you notice when something weird, like, oh, this app just takes a little bit longer to load, or whatever's going on? And that is pause for question these days of, well, what is causing that? Because the answer may be there's somebody else in there looking at it, and it's just taking
Yeah.
extra second to ship it back and forth.
Well, and people can get in now and steal your money out of your account. They can steal the title to your home,
Yeah,
right? And it isn't until, but we're like, oh, I must need to just reboot my phone. I don't know, it's not working right, and they don't pay attention to what's happening, and they blow it off until all of a sudden they go, wait, all the money in my account's gone. What
yeah,
happened, right? And I think the other thing is because we do have banking systems that are uh, they're empathetic to the problem and will help you out, it's not as a big deal, right? Like somebody just took all my money. Okay, I need to call the bank and tell them it wasn't me, and so they'll
yeah,
put it back, and but at what point do they say, oh, sorry for your luck, we can't help you, that was too much money, we can give you $2 back, but we can't give you the 20,000,
yeah.
right?
So just kind of reflecting back on our whole conversation, we spent a lot of time kind of digging at 800-171, that it doesn't give us what we need, which I think is valid. But I also think that it is a really important tool that we have right now as a starting point, because as we know, if there wasn't anything, a lot of companies don't necessarily care at the end of the day about the cyber requirements, because if it doesn't have a direct effect on the bottom line, we don't need it.
Right.
And that's a reality of the society we're in. Not anything necessarily poorly shaped there, but it is where we are. So when we're thinking about working with companies and we're taking them through assessment is a good starting point. How do we highlight when companies are done? How do you like to approach, okay, you've made it through your C3PO assessment, here's what you need to think about. You've touched on a lot of this already, I think, but that 800-171 it's a starting point. Getting your
Yes,
CMMC Level 2 certificate is like I've completed elementary school, we'll call it. It's a
exactly.
lot. Learning to read is hard when you're 6, but at some point there's more than just being able to understand what the words are on the page.
Yes, and it's got to be a continuous evolution, right? And I think, today we look at zero trust, right?
Yeah.
Where the perspective is the bunnies are already in the farm, you've got to figure out how to manage that. And, we've got quantum coming, right? And post quantum encryption is going to be a major deal, right? Because your passwords are going to be able to be broken in 2.3 seconds, right? And most of us really don't have the hard passwords that they like you to have because we are too old and can't remember what they are unless we equate them to something we know. And so now you're in a position where you're done, right? And to be honest with you, they're pretty far. Our adversaries are pretty far ahead at the development of quantum computing. So we have got to wake up. We have got to get to the point where we recognize that, okay, I did CMMC 2.0, which our lawyer used to get mad at us because he said 1.0 never made it out of the gate. So you really can't call it 2.0. It's only ever just CMMC. But we all have adopted the 2.0. That's your starting point, right? What would be my dream and where I would love to see our nation get to is where we do revere our IT professionals and help them and fund them because it's important, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I think today, if you're talking to retail people, the way they cover that credit card information is highly regarded, right? They protect that because that's their responsibility, right? If a company loses your credit card information, you're far less likely to ever go there again.
Yeah.
And so they recognize it as being something extremely important to their brand. We need to understand that from a cyber perspective across the board. To be honest with you, the best place that I think we could get is that we don't need certifications anymore, that everybody takes it so seriously that they do it on their own, and they are continuing to grow
Yeah.
and increase their cyber capability to where they're getting more towards a zero trust perspective than they are just the 110, right?
Yeah.
Because like we said, I mean, if I listen to the Uber cyber geeks, which I am not, right? They say 171 is like what you should do to protect your Netflix, to keep your
Yeah.
neighbor out of from stealing your internet kind of stuff, right? And
Yeah.
so, when you think of it from that bare baseline, we've really got to inspire people to move forward and read and get
Yeah.
interested in and understand. And I'm sorry, it's the wave of the future, right?
Yeah.
Especially with this AI coming out. I
Yeah.
mean, we're going to have to fundamentally change the way we do business.
Yeah. I think that was a great point. I think everyone throws around CMMC as the acronym, and we take a moment and remember that it stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model, and that it is a maturity model to build a robust program.
Right. And we want you to get mature. We want you
Yeah.
to continue to grow and understand. And I think it's wildly imperative, and unfortunately, some companies have struggled, and some companies feel like they're going to drop out of the defense industrial base because of it. And
Yeah.
I am sad. We don't. That's not the intent. But if you can't protect the data, and it gets exfilled, then is it of use to us anymore?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the thing. Pepsi sure as heck doesn't want everybody else to get a hold of their recipe,
Yeah.
right? And if you want to think about that, think about your data, your work, your innovation, right? I think for the defense industrial base, because I'm not going to go, well, hell, I'll just go buy it over in China cheaper, right?
Yeah.
We wouldn't do that. But the implication is, well, hell, China's got an exact replica of that weapon system. And now, when your family member goes into that armed conflict, they got to have great skill to come back alive, right? Or luck. And I don't want to leave it to either one, right? I want my family member to come home.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do want to be mindful of your time. It was so great having you in this conversation, and I think it's really shed some light that I think our main point was this is a starting point. It's a great starting point in some cases. If you're not doing anything, it's a good place to start. But
Yes.
The goal should always be your level 2 certificate, and your assessment is the beginning of building awareness, as you talked about, and is the first step in defending us from keeping this data from our adversaries so that we can continue to do what we do.
That's exactly correct. It is the starting point. Let's grow from here. Let's come together. Let's learn. Let's understand. And let's uplift our nation so that we can be protected. Because the next 9/11 will probably be in cyberspace.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Stacy. It was great chatting with you. And I hope you have a great rest of your week.
I will. Thank you so very much. You guys have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye.